Welcome to Northlandia, a place to bring your curiosity because here you'll find curiosities. I'm Wyatt Buckner of the Duluth News Tribune, and I'll be your guide as we discover the unique and fascinating stories here in the Northland. Here we celebrate the region's distinctive people, places, and history. In this episode, we look back at how a reporter's 1953 expose on living conditions brought improvements to a Duluth shelter. Let's venture forth into Northlandia. Here to take us back to Duluth in the 1950s is reporter Jimmy Lovren. Jimmy, welcome back.
Hello, Wyatt. It is good to be here.
Here today with what I'm dubbing kind of more of a serious story. It kind of falls less under the typical quirky, weird, funny, sometimes funny kind of stories. We're kind of getting more into serious, just kind of the interesting stories of the past in Duluth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe not the funny, quirky, weird historical stories I sometimes bring here.
Yeah, no cows on skates this time.
No, though we did find a photo of that. Moving on, it's kind of one that's kind of in the back of my head here for a while, and I've wanted to do, and so when a few other traditional maybe Northlandia's ideas fell through, I turned to this idea, and that's two reporters, a reporter and a photographer in 1953 going undercover into the Bethel. The Bethel is still here today, obviously, in the Masaba and First Street here. But at the time, it was essentially a shelter for homeless men or transient men. And so they went undercover for 2 nights to show readers what conditions were really like. There was a ton of other reporting with beyond just their observations and candid photos. But what they showed was really a terrible living conditions, people sleeping on the floor, tuberculosis. I mean, it was not good conditions, but it's the type of reporting that spurred some change. So, and now that we have access to newspapers.com, I've heard about this in the past. And so with newspapers.com, a bunch of News Tribune and Herald archives are there, searchable. I was able to find it. So really proved kind of an interesting look back at an investigation we've heard about, but haven't actually seen for a while.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you've been kind of having your eye on the story for quite some time now. Where did you first hear about it?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of where I would have first heard about it, and it's been a few years. I think I think I wrote a story about the Bethel. So the Bethel's executive director is very into history of the organization, and so there's a lot out there about it. It's been around for 151 years? Yeah, it's 151st year right now, and for its 150th birthday, they commissioned some music to kind of tell the history of the Bethel. They had already done a deep dive, hired a historian to make a document about the history of the organization, and then for its 150th had commissioned some music and was able to kind of tell its story through history. So they're very open about the history. This isn't part of it that they're trying to hide. And so
you're not gonna get angry calls from the Bethel about unveiling this 70-year shame on history.
No, they're very open about the history and proud of the history, and that the way the Bethel was able to kind of morph to fit the needs of Duluth and adapt when, it's been pointed out that there's shortcomings. So, so I kind of had that in mind. I remember looking up the reporter, Walter Eldot, and finding, mentions of this story. But we up until just a few weeks ago, most of our archives from this era were all on just microfilm, and they weren't digitized. So I had a date when this story supposedly ran, but the date was incorrect. And so I was looking in the microfilm, and I was like a month off or 30 days off or something because there was a missing digit. And it was it appeared in the May 31st, 1953 magazine insert to the News Tribune. It was called the Cosmopolitan, and it was produced by the News Tribune, but it was like a magazine, Sunday magazine, added to the paper. And the sources that I was finding were saying I think it was saying May 1st or something. And so they missed the digit, and then that error kept being repeated. And so when I looked, I couldn't find it, and I didn't bother, looking through an entire month or two roll of microfilm to find it. Guess what? Newspapers.com rolls around, digitizes all that microfilm. Now you can search. So I searched Walter Eldot, Bethel, right? Mm-hmm. And boom, pops up. It's really easy now. So I was able to read and see the photos. He also had multiple follow-up articles over the next year about it. And then, so there was this, to be honest, some other Northlandia ideas fell through, and this was a kind of always on my mind. And I thought, you know what, this is interesting enough. Maybe not weird, maybe not quirky, definitely not funny, but it's, I think, cool to kind of get it out into the light of day again. 71 years after the fact, 71, more than 71 years after the fact. So that's kind of where that emerged.
Shining some light on what could be considered a darker aspect of Northlandia's history.
Exactly. It's not all, I don't know.
We're not a weird, quirky dystopia.
Exactly.
Utopia of like nothing goes wrong here and we're just all weird and funny here.
Exactly.
And so walk me through what exactly did Eldot discover and how did he go about doing it?
Yeah. So beyond, the photos are really kind of the main part I think they got for those 2 nights that they were there. He includes some of his observations towards the end of the story, and I think some of those observations are intertwined. But he really relies on like health inspection reports, talking to health officials who have inspected or sometimes refused to inspect the facility, and but then goes and sees it for himself. And so he's noting that there are beds available and yet people are sleeping on the bathroom floor. There's plenty of food available, but some men don't eat. Bed bugs were rampant. There were showers in the bathtub there, but no one was given towels or soap. And so they weren't bathing. Many of them slept in their street clothes because they were afraid of, theft, and bed sheets were not changed. It would go like months without changing bed sheets. And so, he kind of highlighted all that, and then it spoke with community leaders and proposed some ideas like reforms and changes, and it got a lot of people's attention. So one thing he noted is that this was a May 31st article, right? And so from the first of the year till then, there were, I think, 5 tuberculosis cases, and 2 of which proved fatal. So, the conditions were bad. And so within a few days of this running, he followed up and had an article about people being taken to Nopaming, right? And we know that now as the creepy abandoned building that, used to be a tuberculosis clinic / eventually a nursing home, and now it's abandoned and whatever.
That could be its own Northlandia potentially at some point.
Exactly. And so that they took men there for screening, x-rays and whatnot to determine whether or not they have TB. So it wouldn't, it at least curb some of the spread of that within this facility. Pretty soon after, the superintendent who was leading the Bethel stepped down, and his son replaced him, and was really, really on board with producing changes. And then I think the following year or later that year, or when was it? 1 year, over a year later, in September 1954, Eldot revisited the facility, and by then, things were cleaned. The kitchen had new equipment. It was cleaner. Things were painted. Unless there were absolutely no beds available, you could not sleep on the floor or a bench. You had to sleep in a bed if there was available. I don't think you could sleep in street clothes by then. So the bed bugs problem that he had observed and heard about in the first article, at least, was getting better. Soap and towels were handed out. Food had improved. And so there were a lot and morale had improved. And so things were really starting to change. And then he kind of, again, had spoken for that first article with community leaders about changes that should be made or could be made, kind of recommending some solutions. And then he did kind of a Bethel box score where he took those and kind of did a check mark on which ones were met and which ones, were in progress or not met, or, and stuff. And so, some real progress by then. From what I understand, he also was asked to be on the board for the Bethel, in which he did, and he served on the board until his death in 1987. So
they clearly weren't so terribly mad at him.
Exactly.
They were like, your name is mud, get out of here, or you're no longer welcome at all.
Right. I think there was a pretty widespread recognition that it was better off improving than continuing down the path that it was on. So, and there were funding issues, kind of what we call now United Way was each community would have its community chest is what is kind of the precursor to United Way. And he did quite a bit of work on or looking into how that money is spent and where it goes in terms of this and other community organizations. And so, but yeah, I think his own personal biography kind of inspired the work he did, not only as a journalist, but as a community member. I mean, he was a long time News Tribune reporter and editor, but he was born in Germany to Jewish parents in 1920 and fled to the U.S. in 1936. But his father, didn't flee, didn't make it out of Germany and died at a Nazi concentration camp. His wife said that he had a period of poverty in his youth, and so that really he wanted to be. He was always so interested and concerned about the underdog and the poor. So that obviously was shown through his work here as a reporter, but also, he was almost more known for his work, community work outside of being a reporter. So when he wasn't being a journalist, he was serving on like a parole board for like young adults that existed at the time for the state, where they would kind of consider reform, different ways of rehabilitation or second chances than they would, maybe a more severe punishment. And he was if you look up his name, you find a bunch of stories he wrote, but also a lot of mentions of him serving on different committees, commissions, boards for different human rights and those types of issues. So
he kept busy.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and it inspired his work here, obviously, but also his work outside the newspaper as well. So, it's just kind of interesting to learn more about him as a person and kind of what drew him to these stories as well.
Mm-hmm. And just out of curiosity, do you know how long he worked at the News Tribune before doing his expose?
So he began working at the Duluth newspapers in 1948, according to his biography attached to his archives up at UMD. Anyway, so he started at 1948, and then he would have done this in 1953, so about 5 years in. And he served as a reporter. I don't know if he retired, because the biography says for the last 4 years before his death, Eldot worked as the News Tribune and Herald's retirement and religion writer. So I don't know if he was semi-retired, if he was a contributor, if he was part-time at that point, or if he was still full-time. But I mean, that's we're talking 40, 41 years.
Mm-hmm. So very relatively early in his career at the.
Yes, this was, yep, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bold move to do early in your career.
Yeah, no kidding.
And do you think, it's hard to imagine, do you think the D&T would ever do something like this today? Do you see yourself or our coworkers sneaking their way into like the Damiano Center or any other organization like nowadays?
Probably not. And kind of speaking more broadly, the ethic is kind of, you don't do undercover unless there's no other way to do it. And that's a pretty high bar to clear. I mean, you see, like, I'm thinking of like TV station, like national TV will do some undercover, like, are you being scammed by your car maintenance, whatever, and they'll send like a man in for to fix a problem with the car, and then they'll have like a woman come in and see if like the responses by shops around New York City would be the same, if it was whatever. It's like there's like those types of things, which I guess, but you really don't in mainstream journalism see undercover stuff, and probably for really good reason. And so I think kind of like the ethic of it is, unless there's no other way to even get any sort of this information, you don't misrepresent or go undercover. Like, that's just not something you do. So I cannot imagine a situation where we would do that. And I don't know exactly kind of what the guardrails they had up for themselves were. They said that they went in, they put on old clothes and just walked in, and no one bothered them. Like, no one registered them. So, would it be different if someone stopped them and asked what they were doing there? I think, today, if we would be, with the newspaper, we wouldn't pretend like we were doing something else. And I don't know if what exactly they did, but they said, they walked in, no one bothered them. So, like, were they really, the way everyone's kind of made it seem like they're going undercover and sneaking in and stuff. And I think
not hardcore undercover.
Right. I think they just walked in and had someone asked them. I mean, I think I don't know. They probably would have just said it, you know?
Yeah, the extent of it was that they put on old looking clothes,
Yeah.
and that's basically it.
Exactly.
At least
Right.
as far as we know from the story.
Exactly. And no one said otherwise. So, I think there's some other, again, I don't think the DNT, I have no idea how many of these stories in our history we've done. There are none in recent memory, several decades of people being here or overlap that I've ever heard about. One example of, I think it may have been Mother Jones or some other kind of publication like that recently did one where they had someone a reporter work as a security guard at a for-profit prison, but he used his real name, and if anyone would have asked if he was a journalist, he would have said so, but no one did. And so it's like, he's like, I didn't, they could have Googled me, they could have asked and I would have been forthcoming, but
Done a background check and didn't.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's,
which I guess that is like a potential red flag for a prison if they're not like vetting, doing background checks on their guards.
Yeah, and I don't know the specifics of how clearly. I mean, yeah, I maybe they were aware and just thought he was done. I don't know the specifics. You should go read the story, I suppose. But yeah, these types of things still happen in journalism, not at the DNT, but widely, But the ethics around them are pretty, they're kind of a last resort, absolute last resort. And then there are guardrails, so you're not, misrepresenting yourself or doing something crummy.
It's also a new age, with technology and cell phones and
right. I mean,
the prevalence of them. Obviously, the prison would be an exception there. Like that wouldn't really help there.
yeah, and, and I imagine if there was, today Bethel is a kind of a half. They focus on substance abuse and corrections services, and so they're a different kind of organization than they were then. But I'm imagining if there was some, we've got shelters here, and if there was some sort of repeated thing that we kept hearing about, and which has not been the case, some poor conditions or whatever, we could probably figure out a way to speak with people who live there and they could take photos for us or, and we could discuss whether or not, the ethics of that or something like that. But we wouldn't need to necessarily be trying to sneak in. To do that type of reporting. So, but in the 50s, cameras were, common, but not super common. And so, I kind of just an interesting way of doing things that probably wouldn't happen today.
It's an interesting side note that the photographer is unnamed.
Yeah.
Expose. That's interesting. I wonder if that is deliberate or by just like the photographer didn't want to, or I'm not sure how good photographer credits were back then.
Yeah, and that's the thing is kind of looking.
Just in general, is our photographers pretty well credited back in old D&T articles? Oh, okay, well maybe that could be why too.
Yeah, sometimes they just are like Herald staff photo or News Tribune staff photo. And that's kind of what was done here. Sometimes they will be. It's kind of inconsistent. So I suppose styles, were changing quite a bit and quickly. And so I don't know why some would be named and others wouldn't or when or whatever and when the shift happened. But yeah, it was kind of weird that it wasn't some, they weren't saying a photographer who wished to remain anonymous. It was just staff photographer. Like, okay. So yeah, kind of interesting. Don't know why he wouldn't have been named, or she wouldn't have been named. But my guess is that it just wasn't common to credit, or name the photographers, broadly speaking. And I don't know when that changed.
Yeah, unlike today, where our photographers are pretty well credited,
exactly
throughout all of the.
If there isn't a credit, it's because we've lost the name in the system somewhere, right? Yeah. Like it's been someone changed the credit and it dropped the name, and now we can't find it. But for the most part, yes, we credit by name, whether it's contributed or Or sometimes, I suppose, contributed photos just get the organization or the agency that provided them. But we always try to get the photographer's name, even if they're contributed.
Yeah. It's like TV or photographers don't usually get credited.
That's true.
I never got credited. At least I very rarely, I won't say never. I rarely got credited when I was working in TV because that's just not how it worked. You know?
Exactly.
not holistically, at least.
And it wasn't like some sort of undercover thing, right? It was just, I don't know how you would necessarily credit photographers on every single story or every single when there's B-roll running from however many different stories from over the years.
There's a couple ways, but not for every single story. It'd be like throwing like a graphic or something or whatever. There's ways, but I also get why they don't as much. But we're getting off topic here.
Yes,
bringing it back. So why do you think this fits for Northland? Because as mentioned before, this is outside of our usual shtick of weird curiosities, or even as we've talked more recently about like how Jay likes to reference like committing to the bit. I guess maybe the bit being journalism, maybe.
I think the undercover part, I think, is weird or unusual enough, and I think it's interesting enough offbeat kind of a history. Obviously, it's not as fun, not as silly, not as whatever, but it is at least, a little odd and out there to imagine a photographer and reporter, spending a couple nights at this really poor condition. At the time, again, it has made substantial improvements and is kind of has changed as an organization over the years, and is not have this reputation by any means today. But again, it to be able to expose that in a unique way, I think is kind of cool to showcase.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jimmy. Well, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Wyatt.
And thank you for joining us on this venture into Northlandia. To read the article for this week's column, visit DuluthNewsTribune.com/topics/Northlandia. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support us, consider becoming a subscriber to the Duluth News Tribune at DuluthNewsTribune.com/subscribe. Join us again next time and discover the extraordinary stories that you just might miss when on the right place at the right time, ready to step off the beaten path with no rush to return, here in Northlandia.